Well, I just like scientists, we tend to not be. I feel like to our own detriment, we tend to not necessarily be the best cheerleaders of our own work. And part of the purpose of this show is to help create an environment where that is a more comfortable thing for folks to do.
Well, what a service.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to Science Sort of. You're listening to episode 330. I am your host, Ryan, and our theme this episode is amber waves of sap and problems of pollen prairies. If anyone would like to put that to music for us, I think America the Beautiful would be an appropriate tune. Send it our way at the contact page at sciencesort.com. But here today to discuss things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science is one of my old buddies from undergrad, Lucas Joel.
Hello there.
And also joining us is Dan Katz.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being with us. So, bit of introduction for both of you before we talk about our first story. Lucas, we went to undergrad together, but we've both hopefully come some distance from when we graduated undergrad. And you were just telling me a little bit about your new position. So, for a while, you were a freelance science writer, and now you have a position at Irvine.
That's correct. Yep. I left the world of paleontology about 5 or 6 years ago to strike out as a journalist. And back then I started with an internship at the now non-existent Earth magazine and took a very roundabout path to UC Irvine, where I'm now the senior science writer for the School of Physical Sciences.
That's awesome. And Dan, you were up in Michigan at one point, and that's something we're about to talk about, but you are currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas, correct?
Yep, you've got that right, down in Austin.
Awesome. So Lucas kind of let us know that the reason he and I were linked academically was our shared interest in paleontology. But one thing I like to ask scientists when they come on the show, Dan, is sort of what kind of scientist do you identify as? And that question can go one of two ways. There's the answer you give to the random stranger who asks you on a flight versus the person you actually want to engage at a happy hour or other sort of social gathering where you may want to talk about your science. So take it however you like.
Well, I have to say, I've been having an identity crisis. So I started off as a plant ecologist, but I spent a bunch of time in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan, and now I'm in a med school. So it's really been jumping back and forth in between things for me. So now I say ecologist, aerobiologist, throwing in a little bit of epidemiology. As I said, it's a lot going on.
Well, I, for one, can't imagine any way that plant ecology could be connected with human health unless there's some story coming out of Detroit that we might want to talk about.
Prelude.
Yeah. So, Lucas, one of the stories you reported on recently was for Undark magazine, which we've actually featured on the show before. I really like the articles that get posted there.
Oh, cool.
And this had to do with pollen in the ruins of Detroit, I guess. How would you, either of you, like to intro sort of the big picture idea of this story?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, but Dan being the main force behind this research, I'll let him describe it.
All right. Well, yeah, I guess the way I kind of think about all of this is interactions between people and the environments that they're in. And this happens in different ways in all sorts of places. And in any city, you have trees, you have plants, you have pests and cockroaches and mice and cats and all sorts of things. And they're all living in the same spaces that we do. And we're all interacting with them. And usually these interactions are wonderful. Like we think of having trees and wildflowers in cities as being a major benefit, and they really are. But sometimes things can go wrong. And one of the ways that things have gone a little bit badly in Detroit is, well, there are a lot of buildings that have been demolished over the last decade or so. I think the statistic is something like 20,000 buildings over the last 7 years or something. And what's happened in some of those cases is that plants have come into those vacant lots. And one of the things which is thriving there is ragweed, which produces prodigious amounts of allergenic pollen. So that's kind of the setting for the story.
Yeah, I guess so. The economic downturn Detroit has faced is that basically the housing crisis, but it never had the chance to recover because so many people left. From the article I was reading that Lucas wrote, it sounds like, that there's an unoccupied area of Detroit that's about the size of Manhattan, and the population is half of what it was at its peak.
Yeah, so the total vacant area sums up to about that size, but as I think Dan will be the first to tell you, it's scattered throughout the city. So that vacant area isn't confined to just one maybe easily manageable section of the city. It's vacant lots dotted here and there, just kind of sporadically. Is that a good representation, Dan?
Yeah, I think of it as a gradient. And you've got some neighborhoods where it's just filled with people and houses and large buildings. And then you have other parts of the city which have been depopulating for, in some cases, dating back to the mid 1960s. But there is a big push to demolish houses over the last 10 years or so. Yeah, and so you have city blocks where there might be a single house left in some places.
Yeah, it was. I remember I was lucky enough to join Dan on some of his mini excursions into the city, and Dan, for the record, has canvassed Detroit, and he's intimately familiar with all its nooks and crannies, and he's explored it and is the best person to describe the landscape there and the plants that are growing in nooks and crannies and in people's yards and on the streets and in vacant lots. But yeah, you drive down streets in Detroit and the neighborhoods look normal upon first glance, but then some odd things sort of start to crop out at you, like these plants look like they haven't been mowed in who knows how long. And then you glance up at a building or a house and you notice that it's missing all its windows, or the balconies are sagging and they're about to collapse. And it's because people haven't been living in these parts of the city for who knows how long.
Wow. So, Dan, how did you first become aware that there was an issue here that might need to be addressed with a plant ecology type solution?
Well, let's see. I guess it all started when I was pretty new to grad school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I was mostly working on topics around forest ecology and climate change. But I had this, I started working with an undergraduate student, Tiffany Carey, who was just starting her freshman year. This was back in, I don't know, maybe 2010 or so. And so we started thinking a little bit about some of the issues around ragweed, and we started doing a couple of little educational outreach projects at a school there. And then we thought, like, hey, maybe it would be a fun project to have some of the kids collect some pollen samples. And kind of through the course of this work and starting on these a series of little projects there, Tiffany and I kind of came upon this topic, and it was just looking around, we saw so much ragweed throughout the city. And so, yeah, it seems like one of these topics which has kind of been neglected. It's I think allergenic and pollen in general, it's the kind of thing where plant ecologists think about it and they say, oh, hey, that's a public health problem or something for allergists to deal with. And then allergists will be like, won't necessarily know the parts of the plant ecology. And then if you think about ragweed in a city, you'd have to be an urban planner to think about all of the history of demolitions and where the city is going in the future. And so we didn't have some marvelous way of like saying, of going from theory to saying, hey, this is what's happening and it needs somebody to work on it. It was more that we just happened into something that seemed like an issue and decided to do some more work on it.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me the most when I was doing the reporting is that, and Dan, feel free to correct me if I don't get something right, is that the National Allergy Bureau only keeps, across the entire nation, only 80 pollen counting stations. And it's from these stations that they issue their pollen forecasts for a city. That's right, Dan.
Yeah, exactly. And so 80 of those across the US, I mean, that's not a huge number. Plus, the other part of that is the measurements that are reported on the news. Those actually come from the previous 24 hours. So,
Well, and are they more variable than the 24 hours previous being useful, or why is that an issue?
yeah. Well, imagine you're looking at the weather and you're trying to decide whether to bring an umbrella. Like, do you want to know what the weather was like 24 hours ago, or do you want to know what it's going to be like in the future?
Fair enough. Yeah, you're reminding me of the at Boy Scout camp we had the weather rock. You guys familiar with this joke?
Maybe not.
It's you build like a little stand and it has a rock on it, or like a little tripod that the rock hangs from the top point of, and then you tell the younger scouts, oh, that's the weather rock, and they're like, okay, well, how does it work? It's like, well, if the weather rock is wet, then it's raining. If it's dry, then it's not raining. If it's covered in snow, it's been snowing. If it's leaning to one side, it's the wind is blowing in that direction. Like it's a dumb joke, but
yeah.
Yeah, but hey, imagine looking at that rock 24 hours ago.
And now if it's covered in pollen, the pollen count is high. We can add that to the joke for the little scouts. You guys are kind of crushing it on answering the questions that I had written down to ask you, because I literally had written like, what do we need to know about Detroit? What do we need to know about pollen? I wrote that I love seeing stories where the science is inherently intersectional, and what are some of the fields of inquiry that go into a study like this. And I wrote about when we get a pollen prediction, where does that number come from? So I basically have out of questions now. I don't know what to do.
Well, hey, don't worry. I feel like we've only dipped a quarter of our big toe into the story. I mean, there's so much more here.
So I guess I will come out and admit, one of the reasons I was so interested to talk about the story is I am a seasonal allergy sufferer. Is the problem with ragweed that it just produces more pollen, or is the pollen particularly irritating? Like, why is ragweed an issue?
Well, hey, it's both of those, and probably any other reason you can think of too. Ragweed, it produces vast amounts of pollen grains, and it's also, the pollen it produces is super allergenic. Oh, and dig this. Ragweed pollen seasons are also becoming longer as temperatures warm, and the pollen that is produced is becoming even more allergenic as carbon dioxide concentrations go up. So not only is it terrible now, it's going to be even worse in the future.
I didn't know it was becoming more allergenic.
Yeah,
I know, right? Terrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what effect were you and the people you worked with finding that this increase in pollen, I guess, so how bad is the increase relative to other cities, or do we even know? And then what effects was that having on the people of Detroit?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. And we have some sense of how much ragweed there is in different places. And it certainly seems like there's a lot more in Detroit. And we know that from comparing those pollen monitoring station measurements that Lucas was talking about. But it's kind of limited, right? Because if you just have a station in one location, then it isn't necessarily telling you everything about what's happening in Detroit. And in fact, in Detroit's case, the regional monitoring station is actually in some suburbs outside of the actual city of Detroit. And so I can tell you there's a lot less ragweed there. So yeah, it sure seems like there's a lot more ragweed in Detroit, but we just don't have a great sense of how much variation there is, just because the measurement technology has really it's only starting to catch up with this century now.
So it sounds like our fine scale resolution just isn't where it needs to be. But from what I was reading in this article, apparently you also dipped your toe into the field of engineering and remote sensing and are trying to solve that problem too.
Yeah, it's been a busy few years, huh?
So can you tell us a little bit about this pollen sensor that you've designed and used to collect some data around the city?
Yeah, totally.
Pretty ingenious.
Well, honestly, it's kind of hacky. I'm an ecologist, right? But I had the good fortune to have some engineering students around that I could buy beer for, and then they could help me figure out some of the subtleties of soldering together Arduinos and some stuff. So basically, we took one of the traditional types of samplers, which is called a rotorod, and basically the way it works is it rotates a little piece of plastic through the air really quickly, and you can calculate how much air that piece of plastic has traveled through if you know since you can set the speed of this, and you put some adhesive on that plastic, and then you can count the number of pollen grains under a microscope. So the only thing that was important about what we did there is we took a device which was literally designed in the 1950s and then just introduced some modern components. And that let us make it for, $25 a piece instead of paying several $1,000s for one instrument. And so having those samplers did let us get to do a better job of monitoring how pollen concentrations varied across the city of Detroit. And there's some really interesting things there. It sure seems like airborne pollen concentrations for ragweed are way higher in the neighborhoods that have had a lot of houses demolished. And so it becomes pretty societally relevant then, because there are already vast disparities in respiratory health. I think the stat is that in Detroit, Black people are hospitalized for asthma at double the rate for white people. And so I think there's a little bit of an environmental justice issue here, and that the neighborhoods that are poorer have more vacant lots in them, which then have more ragweed in those vacant lots and more ragweed pollen in the air. And then we already know that there are these large underlying health disparities, especially around asthma in cities. And yeah, I think in this case, it's well worth thinking about these impacts that this one little plant can have on the people around it. And
absolutely. And it sounds like it's a little bit lose-lose because, Lucas, you mentioned in the article, one of the reasons that people want these houses demolished is because they present risks when they're still standing. So it's not great if they're still standing because people can go there to use drugs. People, can try to live in them when they're not safe to be lived in. There's reasons to make sure that these buildings aren't still standing. But then it seems like the way that they're being demolished is also opening up new problems for the community. And either way, you're having a negative impact on a community of color.
Yeah. And it's sort of, if you can't already tell, it's totally uncharted territory. I was reading this really good book about the history of Detroit, about its rise and fall all the way from hundreds of years ago to today. And one thing is that there's a whole bunch of literature out there about what to do when your city is expanding, but there is almost nothing known about what to do when your major metropolis is shrinking by more than 50%. And so it's a new experiment in our times to watch a city go through these motions.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. So, Lucas, I guess coming at it as a journalist, how do you find out about this story, that this is the work that Dan is doing, and then how do you go about covering it?
Yeah, well, that was happenstance, and that's part of the reporting game that I love, is when a story just sort of emerges and you weren't looking for it, but there it is, and it's interesting you. And Dan and I think the first time I heard about it was when Dan and I were going to the local rock climbing gym in Ann Arbor called Planet Rock. And that's when he started telling me about his research. And I was in Ann Arbor trying to keep my freelancing going. And I'd always been curious about Detroit, which was right next to Ann Arbor, only less than an hour's drive, but couldn't have been more different than where I was living. And I had an inkling of its history and what was going on surrounding its collapse. But when Dan told me about his work, it said to me that this is a really unique way, or a really unique window to look out onto Detroit in a way that pretty much nobody looks at it. And it's a lens that sort of paints a picture of the contraction of the city in a really sort of almost invisible way, because it's not the first thing that you think about when you're imagining a city that's depopulated. You're not thinking about the ragweed that you just drove past, because it's a really sort of non-charismatic plant. And of course, there are a lot of other plants that are contributing to the issue, but it struck me because of its invisibility and because it gave me sort of a gateway into exploring this American city that had piqued my interest for so long.
And it's funny, speaking of like the invisibility of the plant, you mentioned in the article that, Dan, you had to like kind of dress the part when you were going out and doing your field work in Detroit. I think a lot of us, when we think about scientific field work, we think about remote places, we think about hard to get to places. We don't necessarily think about these kind of densely packed urban environments, yet you still were putting on like a high visibility vest and some other gear. Can you talk a little bit about like urban field work?
Yeah, totally. It's a different cup of tea. Like, most ecologists, when they go off and do field work, it's in these preserves and very natural environments, and yet, that's not where most people live. And so working in a city, you get totally different environments and working conditions too. And in Detroit, wandering around a bunch of vacant lots, like collecting measurements on these little nondescript plants, their first thought is, or at least the first few times I went out and did that, their first thought was like, who the hell is this guy? What is he even doing here? And so I ended up kind of through trial and error figuring out that the best way to just kind of be left alone was to look like I belonged. And so I ended up putting on that high visibility vest and carrying a clipboard and a tape measure, even when I wasn't using it. And it was amazing how much easier that made it to fit in. And so it was a different place to do it, but it was also a lot of fun to hang out in Detroit. It's a great city, and there's surprises everywhere. It's got such a rich culture and history, and we've been talking about how the city is shrinking and about the challenges, but it's such a cool place too. There's amazing restaurants, so many really interesting people, and it was a lot of fun to have a chance to work there. And it's a great city. I highly recommend that all of your listeners go and hang out there a little bit. And sometimes I think there's been a little bit of a lot of people think of Detroit and then they just think of either like these vacant lots or like abandoned buildings, but there's so much more going on there. And this is just one little piece of the story of Detroit.
Yeah. It's a vibrant city with, like what Dan said, a lot of surprises. Like there's a market there called Eastern Market that is unlike any market that I've seen. And the architecture in downtown Detroit just it harkens back to the sort of capitalism is unstoppable sort of optimism of the heyday of the auto industry. And you can sort of see that optimism in the way the buildings are built. And it's got so much.
I would love to visit Detroit at some point. The closest I've gotten is Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. My sister went to, is it Eastern Michigan?
EMU. Yeah.
So I got to visit her there once, which was, I had a lot of fun and really enjoyed spending some time there. I think travel's tough right now. I would say maybe for folks who aren't in a position to travel, I think Anthony Bourdain did an episode of Parts Unknown in Detroit.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So I think that might be a good proxy way of visiting Detroit in the meantime, until travel is a little more feasible.
Yeah, for sure.
One question that's kind of been lingering that I haven't really figured out how to phrase. I literally went to a lecture last night virtually on urban heat islands and this problem of urban heat islands and redlining and the history of systemic racism built into, the home buying and the way we set up our communities for home ownership and covenants and HRAs and all those other things. It would seem to me that demolishing vacant lots and letting plants grow would lessen the effects of the urban heat island. So I'm wondering if you, Dan, have any thoughts on sort of the relative trade-off there of the, it's getting hotter and heat in cities is going to become a problem, and maybe plants are part of that solution. But if plants are also causing their own problems, I know that's not the best formed question, but just is there any thought there on the interplay of those two competing factors of the dangers of living in modern urban areas?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's a fascinating topic, right? So Detroit, like so many other cities, does have a big urban heat island effect, but it's right next to a river and also a lake. And so you get some pretty interesting temperature gradients within the city. One of the things that is a big issue is heat waves. We expect a lot more of that to be happening. And there's actually a few researchers at the University of Michigan who are working on issues around heat waves in Detroit and how do you deal with that from a public health perspective. I suspect that the plant side of that it's definitely there. I don't think that it's going to, I'm not an atmospheric scientist, so I don't know the exact amount that taking down these buildings will change the urban heat island, but it's really
you hear a lot about green space as a solution to the urban heat island, and maybe these lots full of ragweed don't truly count as a green space. But I just was thinking about the interplay of plants versus pavement and rooftop shingles.
Yeah, totally, and it's. For sure. And the part I'm less sure about is, having a vacant lot versus a forest versus an abandoned house. And yeah, it's really tricky because you have to weigh all of these different competing things against each other.
Right.
And that is the crux of this issue with when we're talking about vacant lots from an allergenic pollen perspective, like that's just one tiny sliver of what matters to the people living there. And there are also all of these other issues like worries about visibility and illegal dumping, or what animals are going to be living in a place. And so I think that the best way to go about making good decisions about this is to have good information about the effects of each of these different variables, about this allergenic pollen and about the effect on urban heat islands and so on. And I guess I'm just saying I need job security. We need to do a lot more research about this.
I also, it almost became a bit of a running gag. I just wrapped up a year as a science policy fellow. And I think one of the most consistent things that I heard in meetings and discussions across the board was that almost every area of science is reaching a point where to do the science well, you almost need a sociologist involved to make sure that the social component of all the stuff you're doing is also being considered. And those social angles, as you kind of pointed out, are so multidimensional that data is very, very complicated, very, very intercorrelated. And it seems like every scientist I talk to is like, yeah, I need a geomorphologist and a geophysicist and a remote sensor and a sociologist.
Yeah, totally. And throw in some other things there. Like, I want to be real for a moment. Like, I, as somebody who isn't even from Michigan originally, to come in and to do research in Detroit, it's like you have to think for a moment, like, am I just kind of following this legacy of colonial science? And
Yep.
so I think it's really important to think about these things. And in this case, there's definitely a risk of that. And I think here it's
when you say colonial science, do you mean just like a white guy coming into a predominantly minority city doing some science and then leaving? Like, is that
exactly?
I just want to make sure I understand what you mean when you say the term colonial.
Exactly. And I think in this case, the way I justify it is, hey, this work is going to benefit the people that are there. And I did have a chance to connect with plenty of folks who live in Detroit and whose community it is. I only wish I had more time to work on the project. I would have loved to really. So we had a bunch of volunteers who let us place pollen monitors out on their property, but it would have been really exciting to have a chance to work more with some of the people there. And there's some really nice examples of community groups in Detroit working with researchers, especially around some issues of air pollution and also lead pollution. Actually, one of the other things related to the demolitions, a lot of old houses have lead in them. So anyhow, I think that, what I did was just like this one little piece of plant ecology here. And I think the direction that this really needs to go is involving local communities in this work and making sure that it's dealing with some of the issues that are most important to them, and to really get the input from the people who are most affected by these issues and potentially by the research that comes out of there.
I think that's awesome. And that leads me sort of into my next question is, can you tell us a little bit about how you transitioned from plant ecology to where you are now working at a medical school, and sort of is part of this story what inspired you to maybe make that transition and become maybe a more human centered or human service centered scientist? Or I guess I just would love to hear more about that journey for you.
Yeah, totally. No, that's exactly what happened. Doing my PhD, trying to figure out how plants' ranges were going to expand due to climate change. It was super cool stuff. And also it's like, it is happening on time scales of decades to centuries. And it was just like, am I even going to know if I'm right or not? Like, are my hypotheses going to be supported? Like, I might not even live to find that answer out. And good luck trying to get policies enacted that are going to have their benefits manifest on those timescales. And so when I first got into, that's what I found so exciting about this work on pollen, is that it is affecting people's lives right now. And so once I started, I never looked back. It was so cool to be working to take this plant ecology toolkit and then apply it to current problems that are very under-researched. It was amazing. And I consider myself very lucky to have happened into a place where I can do research on plants in a way that directly improves people's quality of life. And I think it's also, it's been pretty cool to have the chance to learn more about the human element of this. So right now I'm working with an allergist at the Dell Medical School at UT Austin, and trying to really figure out the effects on things like the effect of airborne pollen on things like emergency department visits for asthma. And it's really cool. And also, oh my God, people are so much more complicated than plants.
Ain't that the truth?
I remember getting the allergy test when I was younger. I don't want to say kid. I think I was a teenager, a young teenager at the time. The one where they put all the shots in your arm just under the skin to see how you react. And I think I came back severely allergic to every single thing that they stuck me with. To the point of I grew up with a cat and I have a dog. I don't think I don't know, maybe I was just having a bad day allergen wise, but I think
hey, I mean, there's a little bit of a difference.
I'm allergic to allergy tests. That's the issue.
No, seriously, right? There's a little bit of a difference between rubbing the extract from something into the skin underneath your arm or whatever, or onto your back, versus, inhaling a little bit of it. So there's some issues with allergy testing for sure.
I have heard, and I've tried to confirm this, but I would love your perspective. I've heard that cities purposefully plant male trees because female trees would produce fruit, which would then feed vermin or rot in the streets or just not create as pleasant a landscape. But then we're left with these cities that have just a ton of pollen production and nowhere for the pollen to land other than in my eyes and on my windshield.
Totally. That is my favorite scientific term of all time: botanical sexism. And so I don't know exactly how much data there is to back that up, but it's a concept that is out there, and it certainly does happen. It's hard to know exactly how prevalent it is, unless, I guess, you could go around the city and record how many male trees you see, how many female trees, how many in between, because often plants don't stick exactly to two sexes. So who knows? Maybe we should start measuring that as we walk around a little bit.
I know a city planner if you want me to put you in touch. Or I guess a person who works in city planning. City planner is probably a specific position. So it sounds like we need to add someone who's an expert in city planning into the mix with our sociologist and with our allergen health expert and all the other people we need to really tackle this problem.
Seriously. Hey, the more the merrier. It's like with a topic like this where it does cover so many different disciplines, and so it really becomes so important to have people who at least know a little bit about it. I certainly wish I had that whole team with me. I'll take your city planner.
The last thing I want to ask you before we transition to our next segment is sort of, what are you working on now? What are you researching now? What comes next? What are you excited about? What's the future look like for Dan Katz?
So down in Austin, what used to be the live music capital of the world before, the pandemic hit. And what I'm working on down here is scaling up. So all of this work in Detroit was all about creating predictions of airborne pollen concentrations at high temporal and spatial resolution, but it's all just in one city, right? And if you're going to make this really useful, you need to do it on a bigger scale. And so what I'm doing down in Texas is working with something they call cedar fever down here, which is actually neither fever, it's allergies to pollen, and it isn't even a cedar, it's a juniper species, but hey, common names and all that. And so what I'm working on is creating these predictions at a statewide level so that we can do a better job of giving the public predictions that are useful, that would let the people do things like time their allergy medication better, because it often takes a little while for it to reach maximum efficacy.
Oh boy, do I know it. There are mornings where I have to tell my wife, I'm just like, I'm sorry, you're just gonna have to wait until the Claritin D kicks in. I cannot do anything until I feel it in the system.
Exactly.
I'm being totally serious right now too. Like, that's not a joke. Like, I feel non-functional before it starts coursing.
Yeah, totally. So imagine if you had an app or something that would say like, hey, tomorrow concentrations are going to be really high in the exact spot that you live with the things that you're especially allergic to. And I think that would be really cool. And ultimately, the goal would be to get this going on a national level. So that's what
amazing.
I'm up to for the next, 40 years.
I learned recently, this is a crazy coincidence. I recently learned why the juniper cedar thing exists, why the confusion is there. Cedar is apparently the timber designation, whereas juniper is the fruit. So it depends on, like, if you're talking about it in terms of timber production and logging, you call it cedar. But if you're talking about it in terms of like the scientific genus name and the fruit that it produces, then it's juniper.
My understanding was that it was more along the lines of there's this group of plants called cedars that are native to the Mediterranean region, and somebody came over and thought that they kind of looked like that. The plants here kind of looked like cedars. So, hey, either way, it's
I could see that being where it got its start. But yeah, the person I was talking to, this had to do with gin production. So they were trying to explain why certain juniper producing plants were called cedars in the eastern part of the United States. So,
oh, you're going to do a segue, aren't you?
Speaking of gin, we should move on over to our next segment, and that is called What Are We Drinking? And that's coming up next.
All right.
Not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we were drinking. I didn't have a beer. I'm going to go first because I didn't have a beer that was particularly thematic to what we were talking about, but I'm going to fudge it just enough that I think if I didn't go first, it wouldn't work even a little. So I am having an Escape West Coast IPA from Offshoot Beer Company because I want to escape these pollen clouds, these trees offshooting all their pollen.
Very good.
So I had this beer entirely as a joke, and because frequent listeners of the show will have heard me complain over and over again about East Coast style IPAs, and so this one is explicitly West Coast style, which is where Lucas and I met and became friends, and so this felt like an appropriate beer for the occasion. Lucas, you want to go next?
Yeah, I am drinking my favorite tea in the world, which is rooibos, or red tea. It grows only in a very special mountain range in South Africa called the Cederberg. And I'm half South African. And 2 years ago, I got to go live there for a very long time for the first time in my life, and got to go up to the Cederberg and see where this tea grows. And it's in a very mystical sort of place where the fog comes in from off the ocean and reaches the mountains and makes this tea grow. And so it always makes me happy when I drink it.
That's amazing. That's so cool.
That's a good story, Lucas. I feel kind of bad about mine now.
My understanding is that rooibos is an Afrikaans word meaning red bush. Because
Yep.
I used to drink this tea all the time. My consumption of tea has dropped off as I've gotten into coffee and other things. But yeah, rooibos is one of my favorites. It's a non-caffeine, it's herbal, so it doesn't have caffeine, right?
That's right. Yeah. And it's one, I may be wrong, but I think it's one of the only teas that comes from the bark of the plant and not the leaf.
Interesting. That's really cool. So do you have a preferred brand or supplier, or just any rooibos and you're happy?
Mostly just any rooibos. Right now I'm drinking Celestial Seasonings rooibos, and it's special to me. I also have a South African wine in the kitchen called a Pinthotage, which is also only growable in South Africa. It grows when I learned about it, only it sounds like they almost abuse the grapevine. But they force it to grow in really crappy rock and don't give it much water, and it produces this amazing wine. But
On a recent episode, we actually had a sommelier on the show, and she said that making the grapes work for it helps.
yeah, that's why I heard somewhere that drought is not necessarily a bad thing for California wines.
Late season rains actually reduce the quality of the wine produced that season. So like precipitation in October is inversely correlated with the points that wine gets when they make the circuit to get their point totals that year.
Oh, huh. Yeah.
So there's data.
Yeah.
Granted, it's a qualitative data that has a number assigned to it, the points you give the wine, but it's still data.
One reason I'm not drinking is because, unfortunately, I suffer from pretty bad migraines, and red wine is a migraine trigger, but I still keep it because I love it so much. And so when I'm feeling especially celebratory, I'll drink Pinthotage. Migraines be damned.
I think I
Wait, Lucas, is this not celebratory enough?
I felt like I needed a relaxing tea sort of mood for myself tonight.
Celebratory, but he still has to be functional. He's gotta make sense. We can't have him breaking down with a migraine mid-record. That would be
yeah. It's happened where mid something important I'm drinking red wine, and there I go.
No, I think you might be the first person, episode 330. I think you're the first person to have rooibos on the, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. How are you saying it? Rooibos?
Well, technically it's rooibos, but
rooibos.
We just say rooibos. Yeah.
I'll truly are rooibos.
Rooibos.
I think you might be the first person to have that tea on the show.
Oh, well, I'm happy to be unique tonight.
And it really is one of I really do love that tea. If I have to drink an herbal tea that doesn't have caffeine, that's my go-to.
Yeah. Sure. We can talk later about my end of life dream to be a rooibos farmer.
Excellent. All right, Dan, I you were being a little hard on yourself earlier, but I imagine it's not as bad as you think, but go ahead and tell us what you're having.
I'm having an Electric Jellyfish, which is made by Pinthouse PIzza in Austin. It's a hazy IPA. I wish that my story was on jellyfish now, but oh well. I'll have to look around for a pollen-related beer, huh?
There is that jellyfish that is symbiotic with algae in its tentacles. The upside-down jellyfish. Are you familiar with this?
Tell me about it.
It's a jellyfish that in its adult stage has a symbiotic algae that lives in its tentacles, and it flips upside down and rests. It's the part of the jellyfish we think of as the top on the seafloor, so that the algae-infused tentacles can be exposed to the sunlight, and it has like a photosynthetic symbiotic relationship with this algae, and that's how it gets its food.
Oh, wow.
So there's no pollen. I haven't found the pollen angle, but I'm at least getting you closer to the right kingdom of Plantae.
Well, hey, I'll take whatever I can get. The illustrations on it look vaguely like some pollen. Like squint hard enough, right?
Yeah, and I mean, jellyfish are cool. That looks like I am looking at the label right now. I pulled it up while you were talking about it, and that is really cool. It's a hazy IPA, which is just a fancy way of saying East Coast, and you know how I feel about those East Coast IPAs. But are you enjoying it? Is that a style you enjoy?
Yeah. I think it's one of the best beers in Austin. So check it out sometime. I bet you'll like it. Depending on how you like East Coast IPA, I don't know if you love them or hate them.
I am not a fan relative to West Coast and like Rocky Mountain IPAs, but people have heard me rant about that enough. In my mind, if you're not going to filter a beer, it's because you didn't want to filter a beer, not because you're like leaving me something left to be desired. Like it's like unfiltered coffee. Like, no, I don't want hazy New England style coffee. I have to like filter my coffee and then serve it to me. But you can maybe tell I have some strong opinions on this. Well, Dan, you are not going to be joining us for our second segment where I talked to Lucas about another story he reported. So before we let you go, are you active in like the SciComm social media, or do you have a web presence that you would like to let people know about? Where can people find you on the World Wide Web if they want to learn more about your research and just what you got going on?
Yeah, totally. I finally got on Twitter after all of these years, and so my handle there is @PollenScientist. So
that was available? That's awesome.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, because it turns out that the actual technical term is palynologist. That was taken. But hey, pollen scientist works too, right?
Yeah.
English versus
Absolutely.
Latin. I'll take it.
Yeah.
Well, I just followed you from the show account, so you got one more follower.
Well, hey, I'm glad to be bumped up to, 70?
Well, if you could produce Twitter followers the same way ragweed produces pollen, you'd have billions of followers, but also be very irritating. So, you might not want that. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. I also have your website up. Would you like to plug your website as well?
It's just a personal one. If somebody really wants to, stalk my CV and all that, they're totally.
People might. I mean, we have. Are you in a position where you're looking for grad students? Like, we literally have listeners who are at that stage in their career. So,
I'm hoping to be at that stage soon, but not there yet. But hey, if anybody's interested, drop me a line. Tell me your pollen stories. Tell me about what you're allergic to.
Volunteer to put up a station in your yard.
Yeah, totally. Let me know if you want to count some pollen. Let me know if you want to go ogle some trees. See what size they are. Actually, you know what? There is one thing I definitely have to plug. Thank you. I totally almost forgot about it. So in Texas, we're working on this project of trying to quantify when all of this mountain cedar pollen is in the air. And in order to do that on a state level, we're running a citizen science project. And so we're actively looking right now for people to go out and monitor when these trees are releasing pollen. So if you're in Texas or you know somebody in Texas, look up our website. It's a little bit long, so maybe I'll just can we put it in the show notes or something?
Yes, I would have put it in the show notes either way. So if you want to just drop it in the chat or drop me a line later, we will include it in the show notes. But if the project has a name and you just want to tell people the name of the project, that might be a good starting point.
Pollen Trackers.
Pollen Trackers.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Check it out. We're looking for volunteers. You too can, help to make pollen predictions. Yay!
Oh, I'm so excited you remembered that. That's fantastic. That's really awesome.
Yeah, it's a cool project. And plus it saves me from driving all around Texas nonstop for months. So please help me out.
I convinced our condo board. I live in a relatively small building in DC. It's about like 15 units. And I convinced our condo board to buy a weather station to put on the roof because I was like, guys, think of all the data. Like when I look up on my weather app, what's the temperature outside? I'll know it's coming from the roof and not from the house that's 2 blocks away. Who knows what's going on over there? So I'm all about the citizen science and the personal data generation, and I'm very eager to hear if any of our listeners sign up to help you track some pollen. That's great.
Yeah, awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much for having me. It was a blast. And yeah, if anybody has any questions about this stuff, about pollen and ragweed and trees and Detroit and all that, hit me up on Twitter or wherever else. Send me an email. I'm always happy to chat.
Sweet. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Dan. And yeah, if anything else new and exciting comes up in your world, don't hesitate to reach out again and come back on the show and give us an update.
Awesome. Will do. Thanks, Ryan. Good to
All
talk
right,
with
thanks,
you
Dan.
too, Lucas.
Bye, Dan. Great talking to you.
Bye. So for our second story, now that Dan has taken his leave, the reason that I reached out to Lucas originally is because of some of the reporting you did on the situation that's happening with these amber fossil finds that are being published on coming out of Myanmar. Which is, it's complicated, but it's complicated in ways that I think boil down to some pretty fundamental truths and issues that the scientific community needs to deal with. It's going to be a little bit tricky to talk about because we often like to keep the show light. We often like to be a little silly, and there's not a lot that's light and there's not a lot that's silly about these stories, but I think that they're important. So, Lucas, how do you want to sort of intro the general premise of what's going on here?
Right. So there are incredible fossils preserved in amber. And listeners might recall watching Jurassic Park and seeing one of the scenes that showed insects preserved in amber. And entering the science fiction realm, they drilled into those insects and retrieved ancient dinosaur DNA and made dinosaurs. And science reality is that amber, fossils preserved in amber, actually exist. And a lion's share of that amber comes from Burma or Myanmar. And it's essentially the same situation as blood diamonds, where the military situation there is complex. There are suppressed minorities, but what it boils down to is that these fossil amber specimens fetch a very high price in neighboring China, and no one really knows where that money is going.
But it might be the Myanmar military.
Yeah, it might be the Myanmar military, which in the story that I wrote was recently ordered by the United Nations International Court of Justice to protect its Rohingya Muslim minority because of possible genocidal acts.
And this was something that I thought was really, this is something I learned from reading your reporting on this. Was when I hear Myanmar ethnic genocide, my mind went straight to the Rohingya ethnic minority, which is a Muslim minority near the border with Bangladesh. And that's been an incredibly upsetting story of human rights abuses and a lot of Rohingya Muslims fleeing to Bangladesh, which is more sympathetic to them. But Bangladesh has a lot of its own issues, including probably being one of the countries that's going to be more impacted by climate change in the near term than any other nation, especially in Southeast Asia. But I didn't realize that the amber situation was a different ethnic minority. And it's important to point out that Myanmar is a country of over 100 different ethnic minorities. And the ethnic minority at issue with the amber story is the Kachin minority, which is a predominantly Christian minority in the northeast of Myanmar, bordering the Yunnan province in China. So they share a border with China, which is important to this story because that's the border where this amber is getting illegally moved out of Myanmar into China, where it's entering these academic realms.
Right. And it's a situation that, and some of my sources attest to this, is that it's not something that paleontologists are used to facing. It sort of harkens a little bit to what you said earlier about how nowadays scientists need to have sociologists in tow in their groups, because they are coming up face to face with complex social situations like this that they're not used to facing.
Yeah, and so this area where the Kachin minority lives are rich in both amber deposits and jade deposits, two different, mineable commodities that fetch a pretty good price. Amber is obviously the one that has this fossil producing capability, and there's sort of multiple issues that are all kind of stacked on top of each other. One is that the military is seeking to, according to reports, the Myanmar military is seeking to control these mines, and in controlling them, there's some pretty horrific labor abuses that are happening in the conditions of the mining. Mining has always been a dangerous endeavor for the people involved in especially the underground spaces, and it's not getting any better when it's being exploited for profit in this sort of way. And that was a terribly clunky sentence, but the military is trying to run these mines at as much of a profit as they can, which includes, smuggling the amber out of the country across the border to China, where it can be sold to the scientific community at a pretty high price. So you've got both like human rights abuse issues happening at the mining stage, but then you've also got this like kind of flouting of Myanmar's own tax structure by smuggling the fossils out of the country in the first place. And then there's ethical issues as paleontologists when it comes to purchasing fossils, let alone even if those fossils were mined ethically. Stan the T-Rex just sold for an exorbitant amount of money.
Right.
And so there's ethical issues just from the idea of that you're buying the specimens that you study. And then, you can also flip that on its head and say, well, isn't it unethical not to pay the people for their labor?
Right.
But if the money is going to the military that's running this mine and not the people doing the mining, like who, you got to follow the money a little bit there. It's really complicated, Lucas. I don't know how, why did you decide to wade into this, these murky waters?
Well, honestly, it wasn't a conscious decision that I made. I have a circle of sources who I know are doing research that I enjoy writing about. And I contacted one of them who works in China, and I dropped them a line and said, hey, what's new? And that's when they told me that they were about to announce the discovery of the smallest dinosaur ever discovered. It is the skull that, if you go and look at the New York Times story that I reported on this issue in, it's this super beautiful, if you're not thinking about the subject and the issues surrounding it, it's this incredible skull of this little dinosaur encased in amber. And when she told me that, I was like, that I would be so happy to write about that. And so it was like ignorance at play. I was just like, oh, really cool dinosaur discovery. And I get to write about it. And then after going back and forth with my editor at the Times, he told me about this Science magazine article published last year by Joshua Sokol that broke this story about conflict amber. And so that what started out as a cool sort of discovery that would be great for the pages of Nat Geo Kids sort of turned into this story that would be great for, well, whatever the opposite of Nat Geo Kids is. And that's how I fell into this topic. And they were about to announce this discovery really soon. And I reached out to experts in the field, and this has already been a topic that they're talking about, but not every paleontologist knows about this situation. It's not something that is reported on very often. And beyond the story that came out in Science last year, there wasn't a ton of reporting. And so for a lot of paleontologists, it's a new thing. When I reported on this story, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology didn't have a stance on what their membership should do if they have the opportunity to study Burmese amber. And so it's very new territory.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of great stuff that I actually had in sort of my mental plan to talk about. This smallest dinosaur paper has already been retracted because it's probably a lizard.
Huh.
That struck me. That struck me in a pretty profound way, because I feel like if these studies are being published on this amber that's being questionably sourced, and the science is being done in a way that's either rushed or not as careful as it could be, to the point where these big findings that get a lot of media attention are very quickly retracted,
Yeah.
it almost seems more egregious that the source of the fossil might not be from an ethical place.
Yeah, that it's sort of a rush and it's not careful.
And that to me it undermines the whole. If your argument is, well, these fossils are important, okay, I can agree with you that these fossils are important. Why aren't you taking the time to describe them properly? why aren't you really making sure that you get it right? If the argument is these fossils are so important, we can't possibly let them go by and not be incorporated into the scientific knowledge that we have about the fossil record, you got to do it right.
Right. Yeah.
To me, that's just your whole argument that these fossils are so important falls apart, and it just comes across more to me like you were looking for the headline, not looking for the right answer.
Yeah, and I'm sure that that's something that scientists grapple with, and also journalists. Like, it's very tempting to see a juicy thing and sort of lose your mind a little bit.
Right. I don't begrudge people getting excited over stuff. One thought I had in talking to you about this specifically, because you're somebody who has had some paleontology training and then has also had journalistic training. We hear a lot about journalistic ethics. Is that like an actually codified thing, or is that just like an idea that exists? Like, what do people mean when they say that, or what do journalists mean when they say that?
It's not like the Hippocratic Oath. It's not something that a journalist stands up and puts up their right hand or puts their hand over their heart and recites. And from my experience, different places abide by it differently, abide by ethics differently. Like, there are some who say that you should never let a source read a story that you've written, but there are outlets that send their stories to their sources, and people have different ideas about what constitutes ethics in journalism and what's appropriate and what's not.
And so, do you feel like you have, at least with the organizations you've worked with, a clear understanding of what is ethical conduct versus what isn't ethical conduct? Because to me, it's a little surprising that, like, paleontology, vertebrate paleontology especially, not the world's oldest scientific discipline, in fact, kind of surprisingly young given the oldness of the stuff that it studies.
Yeah.
And I'm just a little surprised that we're only now thinking about these issues with any formal seriousness at this moment. Feels like we could have gotten here more quickly. And are we, as scientists, doing a disservice to ourselves and to our community by not having come up with more formal codifications of what is and isn't ethical before now?
From my experience, having done a fair amount of paleontological work before I transitioned to journalism, ethics is definitely something that is on a paleontologist's mind. But is it a discussion that they're having during every single lab meeting? Like, is there...
I mean, no. I mean, having been in a lot of lab meetings, that's the one time ethics came up in a lab meeting, I'll tell you exactly what it was about. And it was about talking to other labs about what we were working on. And basically saying, like, it's not okay for you to talk about what the other grad students in the lab are doing to a lab that might try to scoop us. So it was more of like a protectionism, which valid, like, that's, it's unethical for other labs to be doing that, but it is also something you have to talk about amongst yourselves to make sure you're all being careful.
Yeah. No, if it's not something that's, I have a master's in paleontology, and it was not part of my quote unquote training as a paleontologist.
The main ethics conversations that come up are, especially in vertebrate paleontology. Vertebrate paleontology has a long and sordid history of screwing with other researchers, messing up their data, stealing their data.
Yeah.
The bone wars, right?
Yeah.
It's been a problem forever in vertebrate paleontology. So the main ethical issues in paleontology that have come up in my career have been protecting my data and research from getting scooped. And then really just like the ethics of making sure that what you're saying in your data isn't just actually made up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's about it.
That is about it. And I think we got to do better.
Yeah. Like when I was doing my master's, I was doing field work in Australia, and I wondered, I don't know enough about the history of the area that I was working in, but a lot of that land obviously was traversed by Aboriginals, and it never came up. Like, where does that come into play here? And is it something we should be thinking about as we're excavating these arguably incredible fossils on land that was colonized?
It's something that I think about in my work as well, because a lot of the work I do these days is in Latin America. And I think about it in terms of like, how am I'm so glad. I have to thank you again for getting Dan on the first part of the show, because, his attitude of taking his plant ecology expertise and turning it into like a human focused, human centric thing is so inspiring. And in my own small way, and him talking about decolonizing his science, or at least ways that he could make sure that he wasn't, perpetuating colonial attitudes in his science, is something I think about with the work that I do in Latin America. And like the solutions I come up with are probably trivial, but like I'm trying out different things, trying my best to figure out the best way to make sure that the communities that I'm doing this work in are being served to some capacity. Yeah. And like literally to me, that comes down to when I publish a paper about the work that I did in Costa Rica or Panama or the Dominican Republic, I write an abstract I rewrite the abstract in Spanish. And I've had editors push back on me being like, oh, we don't require this. And I'm like, but I do. Like, right. I get that it's not a requirement for you to publish this thing. I am saying that for me, I would like my work to be at least a little bit accessible, right, to the people who live in that area. And if publishing the abstract in Spanish, I don't have the bandwidth to redo the whole paper in Spanish. Maybe that is a goal I should strive towards. But, that little bit of just like, I don't want this work to be exclusively for the English-speaking scientific community, period.
Yeah. Like if somebody came into my home and found out something interesting about it and didn't want to tell me about it, I would feel amiss.
And so you mentioned the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. The majority of there's obviously a ton of invertebrates being found in the Myanmar amber. I feel like outlets refer to the country now as Myanmar because that's the up-to-date name, but still talk about things being Burmese, like the Burmese military and Burmese amber.
Right.
Just you mean confusing.
Like in a colonial way, like the name Burma.
Right. So that's a little confusing. So I've been trying to avoid doing that, but just to clarify that, that is what we're talking about. SVP did put out a statement. So the controversial fossils have all been vertebrate finds. The tail feathers on the dinosaur, the tiny skull that's like the hummingbird-sized skull that was reported as a dinosaur, but now is probably a lizard. A few other things. So because SVP is sort of the overarching organization that covers vertebrate paleontology, even though these mines produce amazing insect and plant fossils as well, they put out a statement. It was good. Could have been stronger, but they aren't necessarily coming from the strongest negotiating position. They basically said they discouraged members from working on these fossils. Did you see this?
I didn't read it, no.
Okay, so they said that in response to the situation, SVP Executive Committee sent a letter expressing their concerns to the editors of over 300 scientific journals. We've also requested editors to review and update policies around fossil specimen deposition in accordance with the principles of future verifiability that underpin the statements in SVP's Code of Ethics. That may sound complicated. I will explain what it means in a moment, and it actually is scientifically important. The mines are, they reaffirmed that the mines are in part controlled by Myanmar's military, and that the money from the sale of amber, including pieces that contain fossils, may be funding this genocidal conflict. Like, we're talking about a human genocide here. This is not, not without that component.
Yeah.
So it's not just inequitable labor practices, it's also genocide. And it's not even the only genocide happening in that country. So it's bad. And they say that the practice of science has a human dimension and human costs, and it is our responsibility to ensure that our actions are scientifically and ethically solid. So then they say the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology strongly discourages its members from working on amber collected in or exported from Myanmar since June 2017 until the situation in Myanmar changes.
Mm.
So, yeah. I was pleased to see that they made a statement. It would be great if they could say that, like, they run a journal. They have the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology. It would be great if the statement was a little stronger and saying, like, we will not be publishing anything on our own, instead of just the letter expressing concern to editors and other journals. Maybe that internally that is the case, but that wasn't in this letter. But
yeah,
that's sort of where the professional organizational level has kind of staked their claim, just so people are clear on that.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see how it's resonating with people,
because I wanted to see them say something. So I was happy about that. The part that I thought might have been a little technical and confusing was the update policies around fossil specimen deposition in accordance with the principles of future verifiability. What that basically means is you can't study fossils that other people don't have access to, right?
Mm. This
is where the issue with private collections,
right,
private ownership of fossils, Stan being sold to a private buyer.
Right.
If you want to publish a paper on Stan is this T-Rex that was just sold for a lot of money.
Right.
You can publish that paper, but if no scientist, no future paleontologist or any other scientist really has the ability to go measure that same thing you measured on Stan, it could literally be as simple as average tooth length of Stan the T-Rex, right?
Right, yeah.
If I can't go measure those teeth with my own calipers and verify your result, then that's sort of a breach of what it means to be doing science, because science should be done in a way of where the data acquisition is transparent enough and the methodology is transparent enough that somebody else can go do the same study you did and get the same result.
Yeah, and that was one issue with this work.
Yes. And another issue that I think is really important that I haven't seen discussed as fully as I might like, it's been brought up, is if you're smuggling fossils out of a country and the purpose of smuggling them out is to avoid paying taxes and to hide, the labor practices that produce them, you're losing a lot of data.
Mm.
Right? I mean, think about all the data that if these fossils,
the provenance,
the provenance data, if these fossils were extracted properly, or the way that they were extracted was recorded with all the data that could be recorded, you actually have a much better scientific product than you have if a fossil is smuggled across the border and then sold at a market in Yunnan. So to me, ethically, it seems kind of cut and dry that, like, maybe you don't buy fossils from places that use slave labor, but also, like, maybe you don't buy fossils where a bunch of the data was lost because they were smuggled and hidden.
And I think that's why there's been a response to it, and why folks from the American Museum of Natural History to researchers in Europe are saying, just go study something else. There's a whole big world out there where you're not going to get caught up in this bog of ethical dilemmas.
So as a journalist, like, how much do you feel empowered to take a stance on these issues versus just report on them as is, or, what's sort of the journalistic take on that?
It's a topic that I would want to return to, just for the fact that I think that journalism can do good when it exposes truths like this. And I personally think that there's there is a humanity to what we do as journalists. It's not robotic. There are humans behind the keyboard, and those humans, whether they know it or not, ascribe to a set of principles, and they are at play every time you make a move in the world. And when I publish a story, if it's at the very least, it's a neutral story that's about some cool discovery that happened somewhere. And when possible, it's something that highlights suffering somewhere, like this story, and maybe wake some people up to the fact.
I think you just clarified a point I was having a hard time articulating, and so I thank you for that, because I traditionally think of science reporting as people who understand science making the science accessible to a broader audience, because we write our papers for specialists, for better or for worse, right? Even if you're publishing in a more general journal like Science or Nature, papers are still written for specialists. And I think of science journalism typically as this really powerful way of how do we broaden the scope of who this reaches by getting somebody who is trained to tell the story to a broader audience to sort of take the material published in a technical way and produce it in a more accessible way. I don't tend to think of science journalism as needing to be the sort of fourth estate speakers of truth to power, exposing things that were trying to be hidden. And I think what we're seeing with this story is journalism is playing more of that role. It is uncovering some things that maybe people don't want uncovered about the way that this research is being done. And I think that's really important. And I think that it's necessary. And I think that it also is sort of a shame that we're at a moment where it needs to happen, but it does need to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I can never step back far enough and feel like I'm not influencing in some way by the things that I write or the choices that I make, influencing in some way the sort of moral drama that's always going on around us. Even if I say that I'm an objective journalist, yada, 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 it's going to have effects on the world. And I can't ignore that fact.
Well, it's, to me, and maybe sort of start wrapping up our thoughts on this, getting back to the beginning of the discussion, I had a strong opinion on how I felt about the ethics of the situation.
Yeah.
If you can't prove that an enslaved person didn't find your fossil for you, you probably shouldn't publish on that fossil. Seems pretty cut and dry to me.
Yeah.
To me.
But not to everybody.
But not to everybody. And I had that, strong moral stance, not even getting the ethnic group of the people being exploited correctly, because I just assumed it was the Rohingya. So clearly, your reporting as a journalist, to me, a vertebrate paleontologist, I don't work on this stuff exactly, but I am a vertebrate paleontologist. I still needed your journalistic explanation of what exactly was even happening about a thing I had already made my mind up about, which probably means I need to be more open before going into these things. But I had a lot to learn about the human component of this before even getting to our discussion with you about some of the scientific and ethical components of it.
Yeah, and part of the hard part is that maybe just specific to this article that I published is that it's already out of date. That retraction happened that I didn't know about. And when I interviewed a lot of my sources, they talked about how volatile the military situation is there, where it's not clear from day to day which lands the military is besieging or controlling or not. And so you don't know if this amber came from part of those lands or not. And there's just this cloud of ignorance, and who knows what's happening on a day-to-day basis. But I think in a broad context, you know what the situation is and get the main points.
And in a deep time perspective, I guess I don't see what's the rush, right? I get that.
Yeah.
I get that we as paleontologists, we have careers that exist on human timescales, but these fossils don't.
No.
These fossils are from the Cretaceous. They can wait, they can wait to make sure we do it right and we do right by the people.
Yeah.
I think that's how I feel. And I guess one other question I wanted to ask you, and maybe not quite as hard-hitting an ethical question, was what was the response to the article? Did you get feedback from folks, or like how did you feel that it was received by both the public and by the community of scientists you were reporting on?
I think it was well received. It was one of the few stories that I've written that had to be checked out by lawyers to make sure that the Times wasn't going to be sued by anybody. And so that was a process for me. And I think it was then that when my editor told me that this was being checked over by lawyers, that I realized that it had some seismic activity to it beyond what I was used to. And I think it was important and a big story in terms of like, is it more important than a more fun story talking about a fun new fossil discovery with no ethical issues surrounding it? From my personal standpoint, I have as just much fun talking about the fun story compared to this story. Like, they're both interesting equally to me. And like, from a storytelling standpoint, like, it's going to be something I want to tell people about. And that's just my own way, as it were.
Yeah, totally. And I think this story of the Myanmar amber is not over.
No.
There are hundreds, if not thousands, of specimens in labs all across the place that are waiting to be published on. So there will probably be more publications that come from this sort of questionably ethical amber, even if people are abiding by the guidelines put out by SVP. These specimens might already be in the process of getting published.
Right.
So it remains to be seen where this is going to go. I don't think we know the ending yet.
No. And I'm curious to see how it unfolds, because it's something that you never would have thought you'd get into just going into, say, a discipline where you're driven solely by the fact that you're excited about discovering amazing things. You don't think that you're going to be thrust into the world stage politically.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on, because I think what you're saying speaks to the fact that sometimes our excitement over the new discovery overshadows what it cost to get us there.
Yeah. And there's always more going on than you think.
Well, Lucas, thank you for joining me.
Yeah.
Sorry for the sort of heavy subject matter.
Well, I think now I'll go get that wine.
I think it's important that I point out that I think of Lucas as a generally happy person. I'm sorry, but,
until October 8th, 2020.
Well, I'm glad I got to catch up with you. It's been a while. I think the last time we interacted in person was I saw you reporting, I saw you interviewing somebody at the AGU fall meeting. I like tapped on the glass because I was outside on the sidewalk and you were inside. Waved.
Yeah.
Which is a COVID appropriate interaction, but not one that was necessary at the time.
No, well, it's okay because that story didn't go anywhere anyway.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. Well, how are you liking your new gig? How's life back in sunny California or smoky California, whichever mode of California you're in?
Yeah, it was pretty smoky here for a while. And I grew up in California, so it was like a teensy bit heartbreaking to see this state turn orange. And aside from that, I mentioned that I have this new writing position at UC Irvine, and it is essentially my dream writing job. I couldn't have imagined a job better than this one, as a reporter who's sort of embedded in the School of Physical Sciences, which includes the UCI departments of physics and astronomy, math, chemistry, and earth system science. And I'm basically the small town reporter who picks up on the really cool science that they're doing, and I write about it in-house for in-house audiences, but also for the mainstream media. And we just started a podcast, and we're doing some other things. And
Wait, are you on the podcast? Are you also? Should I have introduced you as fellow podcaster?
Perhaps. It's relatively new territory for me, but I think I'm getting the hang of it.
All right. Well, if you ever want to do a crossover episode, obviously this show began its humble beginnings in the labs of Earth and Marine Planet Sciences of UC Santa Cruz.
Yeah, I
so
think
we're sort of a UC show.
I think I remember you talking about it back in the day.
Do you remember the flyers I posted around the building?
I probably saw them, yeah. But I remember like your logo is the jackalope?
Brachylope. It's the
Brachylope.
Dinosaur with the jackalope style antlers. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't look close enough.
Yeah.
You know, it took me longer than it should have to realize that the jackalope wasn't real.
So you're saying we had bad logo design in the early days of the show?
Perhaps.
I'm hesitant to disagree with. Well, you were always an invert paleo guy. What do you know? You don't know verts.
Yeah. No, I went the invert route and had a good time in the Ediacara, and life continues to send me down fun paths. So I'm grateful for that.
Folks obviously wouldn't know because you haven't been on the show before, but we almost went to grad school together.
Almost. I remember that trip to Nashville.
I almost missed the flight to Nashville, and then we almost both went to Nashville to go to Vanderbilt.
Yeah, that was 10 years ago now.
Wow. Yeah, I guess it was. That was one of those literally running through security, running to the gate. I mean, I think we were sat next to each other, so I think you remember me like flopping into the seat at the last second, covered in sweat.
Yeah. Now that you say it, you're conjuring my memory. Yep.
I think I lost a camera on that trip because it fell out of my bag while I was running through the San Jose airport.
And then you ended up going there, and I went to UC Riverside.
Yeah, which I think was the right decision for both of us.
Yeah, no, UCR was it's actually where I got into science writing, and I met the editor who ended up telling me about this UC Irvine job. So it's all connected.
So I was sad we didn't get to continue our academic trajectories together, but I was very glad to get to spend time with you when I did as undergrads. And it's been great to reconnect with you as in the months it's taken us to get this podcast happen.
Well, I feel like our paths will cross again.
I hope so. If you like report on like UC Irvine scientist discovers what makes people happy and it's nice, and then we can go on and talk about that. I would appreciate the opportunity to some lighter fare, maybe.
Yeah. Well, there's pretty much anything you can imagine coming out of those departments. So I'm happy to talk about that sometime too.
Well, for you specifically, where can people find you on the internet? Where can they find you reporting either what you did previous to this job or what's coming up as you produce all the cool stuff you're producing with this job?
Yeah, so there are a couple places where you can find my work. The newest things that I'm publishing appear on the UC Irvine School of Physical Sciences website. We just launched a new website, and if you head over to their news section, you'll find all of my stories. I'm on Twitter at Lucas von Wyk Joel. That's Lucas VANWYK Joel, JOEL. And my personal webpage, which I'm very proud of, is called phoenixandcricket.com. That's spelled as it's spelled. And
can I ask for the origin of that name?
Yeah, it's kind of complex. So I went to start my PhD at the University of Michigan, which is where I met Dan. And there was a cataclysmic period where I realized I didn't want to continue in academia. And I was very much ashes. And I thought, okay, I'm going to rise from this. And I'd for a very long time, ever since Santa Cruz, where they have the science communication program. I never went to that program, but I knew about it when I was there.
Neither did I, and I feel like we both probably should have.
Perhaps, yeah. But I took an undergrad class that was offered by the program, and I was only in it for like 2 weeks before I had realized I had to satisfy some other requirement. But it was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to take a really solid stab at journalism. And when I left Michigan, I said to myself, we're going to do journalism. And I've very much associated with the Phoenix idea. And then cricket I was fantasizing at the time about sort of living in a trailer and visiting national parks. And my grandmother heard about my fantasy, and she didn't have a computer or anything. She still got catalogs, and she saw a trailer in a catalog that was called The Cricket. And she snipped it out with her scissors and saved it for me for the next time that I went to go see her. And she was like, I was thinking of you, and I thought you'd like to see this picture of a trailer. And I was like, it's called The Cricket. Okay, I'm going to name my little rag that I'm creating Phoenix and Cricket. And it's really a labor of love because it combines two of my obsessions / passions, which is journalism on the one hand, and I really enjoy writing fiction in the genre of magical realism on the other hand. And it's a place where I get to do both of those things.
I love that. That is awesome story. I'm so glad I asked for the explanation. It is reminiscent to me of sort of a long-standing inside joke I have with my wife.
Mm.
We met in Costa Rica.
Oh.
One of the most beautiful birds, I think, that is down there in Costa Rica is the motmot.
Oh.
Blue-crested motmot, I believe, is the specific one that we were... blue-crowned motmot, she yells from the other room. And for a long time, her pet name for me was Potato, which might tell you something about my physical fitness regime. And she's yelling that's not it from the other room, but I'm skeptical. Well, we don't have time, Julie. But I just sent you a link to in the chat of she did scientific illustration for a while. So
nice.
Like a drawing she did of the Potato Motmot duo and like the whole Phoenix Cricket thing
combination, yeah,
of a beautiful bird and a plainer thing.
Is it actually called the Potato Motmot?
No, that's the thing we made up. It's just just a potato and a motmot together.
I like it, and that's your origin story.
That's sort of our origin story. Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah,
well, Lucas, this was a delight. It was so much fun catching up with you a little bit. I feel like we barely caught up. We mostly just dove right into the content.
Yeah, there's a lot that's happened, but we are all filled with novels, so it would take a while to get through all of it.
Well, that's a beautiful sentiment to end on. Thank you again so much for joining me, and it was really great chatting with you, and thanks for connecting me with Dan, and have a great rest of your evening.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
All right, so that was my conversation with Dan and Lucas. Thank you so much to them for giving us all the time that they did. Two really meaty topics that I was really glad we took the time to dig in on, but I don't want to keep you any longer than absolutely necessary, so I will go ahead and do a quick PaleoPOW for you all. PaleoPOW is a segment of the show where we take feedback or just say thanks to the listeners, and saying thanks is what I'm doing this time. I am saying thanks to Dan K, because Dan K is one of the few remaining PayPal recurring donors. That used to be the system that we had for continual support of the show back before Patreon, and Dan signed up for that, and so gives us a few bucks every month to help keep the show going, which we really, really appreciate. Thank you, Dan, so much. I've hung out with Dan before. Dan's a great guy, so I'm excited that he is still on board, still part of the team, still part of the family. And, you know, we can say that you made this episode happen. That's kind of how we do it when we do the PayPal recurring donors. We essentially say you sponsored this episode whether you wanted to or not. Hopefully you enjoyed the content. If not, you know, you got my email. Let me know. I can thank you again on an episode you liked better. I'll offer that. But I think this was a great episode. I really enjoyed talking to Dan and catching up with Lucas, who I hadn't caught up with in a while. So hopefully you all enjoyed the conversations as well. Lots of great links at the show notes on sciencesortof.com for this episode. Check us out on social media. We usually just post links to the shows, but there's also some discussion that happens there as well on Facebook and Twitter. Write us a review anywhere you get your podcast from. That is super, super helpful. And with that, we will see you next time for a whole lot more science. Sort of.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
What was it when you were studying ground sloths in Costa Rica that you met your wife?
I haven't actually done any ground sloth work in Costa Rica, ironically enough.
Oh.
No, this was undergrad when I did my study abroad in Costa Rica. We weren't dating at the time.
Uh-huh.
We were just friends, and we became romantically entangled like a couple of months before I moved to Nashville.
Entangled.
You're both mocking me simultaneously, and so I'm getting mocked in stereo. She's mocking me through the room. You're mocking me on the call. What was I supposed to say?
It's a good word.
Trying to be polite here.
I was romantically compromised.